Daddy, why don't you believe me? The words erupted through the lingering silence of dawn, echoing off marble floors and heavy curtains. A cry from Claire that Joe Craig has heard before, but always managed to ignore. For 3 years, Craig Mansion has been a place where grief lives in every shadow. Joe Craig, a billionaire haunted by regret, watches his daughter limp through the corridors, crutch tucked under her arm, eyes downcast, every step echoing the accident that stole his wife and shattered his family. Maggie Grey, gliding through the halls in impeccable style, smiles warmly whenever Joe is near. But when his back is turned, her elegance curdles into cruelty. Claire shrinks, silent and afraid, bruises hidden behind a wall of shame. The only person gentle enough to notice is Anita Morgan, the maid. Her quiet kindness shields Claire from Maggie's venom, but Anita's own voice is drowned by the mansion's hierarchy. Joe's certainty cracks. He begins to wonder, is his daughter's pain just trauma, or is there a deeper wound, one he's refused to see? What he discovers, and as he attempts to become invisible in his own home, will destroy the lies and expose a darkness that no amount of wealth can hide. The morning sunlight floods the living room, illuminating the polished wood, and the moment Joe, disguised as the new chauffeur, witnesses Maggie kick away Claire's crutch. Claire collapses, pain etched across her face as Anita throws herself to shield her, fierce and trembling. In that instant, Joe sees the true balance of power and knows he cannot remain a bystander any longer. As Maggie's shoes click out of the room and Anita quietly comforts Claire, Joe realizes the mansion's silence has always hidden more than loss. It's time to uncover what lurks beneath and confront the truth he's long denied. The afternoon sunlight crept hesitantly across the polished floors, but its warmth stopped at the threshold of the living room. Inside, the air was tight with invisible rules, ones Anita Morgan learned to navigate each day. She moved quietly, her steps practiced at blending into the background, always attentive, always watching. Maggie Grey sat poised on the edge of a velvet sofa, her voice slicing the stillness. Claire, don't drag your feet. Honestly, how will you ever walk properly if you slump around like that? Her tone was sugar-laced for the world, but Anita saw how the words dug into Claire's small frame. The girl tightened her grip around her crutch, eyes on the floor, shoulders rounding as if she could make herself disappear. When Mr. Craig was home, Maggie smiled with effortless warmth. She patted Claire's back and spoke of therapy and rehabilitation. But the moment he turned away, the temperature changed. Anita watched Maggie critique Claire's dependency, snapping at the child for missing a step, scolding her for asking for help. Sometimes Claire's crutches would suddenly vanish, hidden in a closet or behind a locked door, forcing her to stumble, crawl, or wait in tears until Anita came searching. Today, Anita found Claire trembling in the hallway, fingers white around the stair rail. Aunt Maggie took my crutch again, Claire whispered. She says if I can't walk, maybe I shouldn't live here. The words were soft, but the bruise on Claire's shin said enough. Anita knelt and wrapped an arm around the girl. Claire, you know your father loves you. You should tell him what's happening. Claire shook her head, pain flickering in her eyes. He won't believe me. He thinks I'm just sad because of Mom. Maggie's footsteps echoed behind them. Claire flinched, shrinking deeper into Anita's side. Really, Anita, Maggie said, voice frosty. She needs discipline, not coddling. Careful not to show fear, Anita stood her ground, placing herself between Maggie and the child. As Maggie's presence filled the mansion, her commands, her glances, her twisted kindness, Anita realized she was the only shield standing between Claire and daily humiliation. Mr. Craig's trust in his sister-in-law blinded him to the undercurrents swirling through these grand halls. Every unexplained fall, every missing aid, every tremble in Claire's hands pointed to one truth. Anita was alone in her fight to protect this child from the darkness wearing silk heels. And with each passing day, the burden on her shoulders grew heavier, matched only by her resolve. Joe Craig sat alone in his office, surrounded by files he couldn't focus on and contracts that blurred into meaningless words. The evening had settled over the mansion like a heavy blanket, muffling the world outside. He pushed back from his desk, rubbing his temples, when a sound pierced the silence. Soft, broken, barely audible through the thick walls. Claire was crying. He moved toward the hallway drawn by instinct and paused outside her door. Her voice trembled through the crack, small and shattered. Dad doesn't believe me. The words hit him like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. He never believes me. Joe gripped the doorframe, guilt flooding his chest. How many times had he dismissed her fears as trauma? How many times had he convinced himself that grief was making her fragile, imagining threats where none existed? The next morning, he couldn't shake the weight of those words. He found Maggie in the drawing room, perfectly poised with tea and a serene smile. Maggie, I need to ask you something, Joe began carefully. Claire seems afraid. Has something happened? Maggie's expression softened with practiced sympathy. Oh, Joe, I was worried you'd notice. The poor child is so dramatic lately. I've tried to help, truly I have, but she twists everything I say. She sighed, placing a delicate hand on his arm. She's emotionally unstable, Joe. The accident damaged more than just her legs. Perhaps we should consider therapy, or somewhere she can get professional help. Joe felt the familiar tug of doubt. Maggie had been nothing but supportive since his wife's death. She'd moved in to help, sacrificed her own life to care for Claire. Could his daughter really be fabricating stories about her own aunt? Later that afternoon, he found himself drawn to the hallway again. Through a half-open door, he saw Anita kneeling beside Claire, speaking in low, soothing tones. Claire's small hands trembled as she gripped Anita's sleeves, tears streaming down her cheeks. Anita didn't flinch, didn't pull away. She simply held the child with a tenderness that made Joe's throat tighten. Something stirred in him then. Not just guilt, but clarity. Anita had no reason to comfort Claire so fiercely if the girl was merely dramatic. There was truth in that embrace, trust that his daughter no longer gave to him. Joe retreated to his office, heart pounding. He needed to hear Claire's truth without the weight of his presence silencing her. He needed to become invisible in his own home, someone she could speak to without fear of disbelief. The idea formed slowly, then all at once. His regular chauffeur was on leave. A temporary replacement wouldn't raise suspicion. If Joe disguised himself as the new driver, Claire might finally speak freely. She might reveal what she'd been too terrified to tell her father. It was drastic, perhaps even desperate, but as Joe stared at the photo of his late wife on his desk, he made his decision. He would become the chauffeur. And he would finally listen. The garage was dim and cool, smelling faintly of leather and polished metal. Joe Craig stood before the mirror mounted on the wall, barely recognizing the man staring back. Gone was the tailored suit, the expensive watch, the confident posture of a billionaire who commanded boardrooms. In their place, a crisp black suit jacket with matching trousers, a plain white shirt, and a black chauffeur's cap pulled low as over his eyes. He adjusted the cap again, shadows deepening across his face. His hands that signed million-dollar deals, now wore simple black gloves. The transformation was startling. He looked ordinary, invisible, exactly what he needed to be. The intercom crackled. Mr. Lewis, Miss Claire is ready for school. Joe's pulse quickened. Mr. Lewis. The false name felt strange on his ears, but it was his lifeline to the truth. He slid into the driver's seat of the black Mercedes, gripping the steering wheel to steady his nerves. Moments later, the rear door opened. Claire climbed in carefully, her crutch tapping against the car's interior. She settled into the seat with a quiet sigh, her small frame seeming even smaller against the leather upholstery. She glanced up briefly, meeting his eyes in the rearview mirror, then looked away. Good morning, Miss Claire, Joe said, keeping his voice low and neutral. I'm Mr. Lewis, your driver for today. Good morning, Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. They pulled out of the garage and into the tree-lined streets. For the first few minutes, silence filled the car. Joe's heart pounded in his chest, every instinct screaming to turn around, to reveal himself, to hold his daughter and promise her safety, but he forced himself to wait. How was your morning? He asked gently. Claire hesitated. Okay, I guess. Just okay? She shifted uncomfortably, fingers fidgeting with the strap of her backpack. Then, as if a dam had broken, words began to spill out. Aunt Maggie, she says I walk funny. She makes fun of my limp. Yesterday, she hid my crutch and told me I had to walk without it or I'd never get better. Joe's hands tightened on the wheel, knuckles turning white. She calls me weak, Claire continued, voice trembling now, and pathetic. She says Dad's ashamed of me because I can't walk like normal kids. She says, she says if I don't stop being a burden, she'll send me to a facility where people like me belong. The world tilted. Joe's vision blurred at the edges, rage and horror warring inside him. Sometimes she locks me in my room, Claire whispered, for hours. Anita is the only one who checks on me. But Aunt Maggie says if I tell Dad, he won't believe me. And she's right. He doesn't. Joe's chest constricted, every word a knife twisting deeper. This was his daughter, his child, suffering in silence because he'd been too blind, too trusting, too consumed by his own grief to see the monster living under his roof. His world cracked open, shattering the illusion he'd built around Maggie's false kindness. And in that moment, Joe Craig knew exactly what he had to do. Joe followed Claire inside, his chauffeur's cap low, his heart pounding with dread. He lingered near the doorway, masked by the uniform and the ritual of staff presence, just another servant in the eyes of the household. Claire moved through the living room, her steps uncertain, fingers clutching the crutch as if it might vanish at any moment. Suddenly, Maggie appeared. Her lips drew into a cold, gleaming smile. Her tone, syrup with an edge, crackled through the air. Claire, aren't you tired of leaning on that thing? Stand up straight. Before anyone could react, Maggie's heel struck out, catching the crutch and sending it skittering across the polished floor. Claire lost her balance and crumpled to the ground, her cries sharp and desperate. Joe's breath snagged in his chest. Time slowed. Maggie's face twisted with satisfaction. No trace of sympathy, only venom thinly disguised as discipline. She stood over Claire, eyes narrowed, her presence looming and cruel. Without hesitation, Anita darted forward. Kneeling beside Claire, she wrapped her arms protectively around the shaking girl, shielding her from Maggie's sneering glare. "That's enough," Anita shouted, voice trembling but fierce. She stared Maggie down, ignoring the threat in her posture. Maggie stepped back, unfazed, a mocking tilt on her lips as she glanced toward Joe, seemingly just a nameless driver, beneath her notice. "See what I mean?" she said, gesturing with disdain. "She'll never learn if you spoil her." Joe froze at the threshold, muscles locked, fury and horror battling for control. Every instinct screamed to throw off the disguise, to expose the monster in their midst. But he forced himself to watch, needing irrefutable proof. This was the evidence he could not ignore, the reality he'd shielded himself from for too long. Claire's sobs echoed through the room as Anita whispered words of comfort, her own eyes shining with anger and worry. Maggie turned, a final smirk curling her lips, and left the room with calculated indifference. Joe remained motionless, hands shaking. What he'd witnessed shattered every last defense, flooding him with guilt and righteous fury. For the first time, the shadow over his home was no longer invisible. It wore a human face, and Joe Craig would never let it hurt Claire again. But he did not move. Not yet. He knew this moment must be just the beginning. With Anita comforting Claire and Maggie's cruelty exposed, Joe understood. The truth would soon be undeniable, and justice would finally come to the Craig mansion. Joe sat alone in his study, the door locked, a laptop screen glowing in the darkness. On the desk before him lay 3 compact hidden cameras, small enough to blend into smoke detectors, picture frames, and wall clocks. His hands moved with precision born of fury, installing each device with careful deliberation. Every angle mattered. Every room Maggie frequented would now be watched. He worked through the night, returning to his study only when the network was complete. The cameras fed silently into cloud storage, recording everything. Joe couldn't afford to miss a single moment. Not anymore. The first recordings came within hours. Joe watched, jaw clenched, as Maggie entered Claire's room. The girl sat quietly on her bed, attempting homework. Maggie's voice dripped with contempt. "You know, Claire, you're dead weight. Your father works himself to exhaustion. And for what? To support a crippled child who can't even be grateful." Claire's small shoulders shook, but she said nothing. Maggie leaned closer, her tone venomous. "If you keep causing problems, I'll make sure he understands you're better off somewhere else, a facility where they deal with children like you. Joe's fists balled so tightly his nails drew blood. The next recording was worse. Maggie stood in the hallway, phone pressed to her ear, voice smooth and calculating. Yes, I've been documenting everything. Joe's emotional state, Claire's instability. Once I petition for guardianship, it's only a matter of time. She laughed, cold, hollow. He's too grief-stricken to fight back. And once Claire's inheritance is under my control, the Craig fortune becomes mine. All of it. Joe replayed the audio, each word searing into his mind. She'd never come to help. She'd come to conquer, to exploit his grief, manipulate his trust, and steal everything his late wife had wanted Claire to have. Another clip showed Maggie mocking him behind his back, telling a visitor over tea, "Joe's pathetic, really, still mourning like a broken man. He'll sign anything I put in front of him." Her laughter echoed through the speakers. Joe leaned back in his chair, heartbreak hardening into something colder, sharper. The woman he'd welcomed into his home, believed in, defended, she was a predator, and Claire had been her prey all along. He saved every file, backing them up multiple times. This wasn't just evidence, it was justice waiting to unfold. Maggie had underestimated him, mistaking his grief for weakness. She'd believed she could hide her cruelty behind charm and family ties. But Joe Craig was done being blind. The recordings painted an undeniable portrait of abuse, manipulation, and greed. And now, armed with the truth, he would dismantle Maggie's carefully constructed lies, piece by piece, exposure by exposure, until there was nothing left but her reckoning. The morning breeze barely stirred the heavy curtains as Anita moved quietly through the upper bedrooms, dusting and checking linens with her practiced care. She was halfway down the hallway when Maggie's voice pierced the calm, sharp as cut glass. "What's this doing in your cleaning cart?" Maggie demanded, holding up a glittering sapphire bracelet, the one Mrs. Craig used to wear for charity events. Eyes flashing with accusation, Maggie thrust the jewel forward, loud enough for echoes to carry. Anita's breath caught. Before she could reply, Maggie spun toward the staircase, calling for Joe and security. "Joe, come quickly! Anita's been stealing from us. I found Claire's late mother's jewelry in her cart." Her words rang with righteous fury, but her eyes stayed cold and calculated. Within minutes, staff gathered. Claire appeared at the landing, her face pale. She rushed to Anita's side, clutching the maid's arm. "Please don't let them take her. She would never steal." Claire sobbed, voice shaking. "Please, Mr. Lewis, you have to believe us." Her eyes pleaded with Joe, still disguised as a chauffeur, for help. Maggie pressed the attack. "We can't have a thief in this house. We trusted her, and this is how she repays us?" She glared at Anita, pressing closer, spinning a tale of betrayal. First emotional manipulation, now this? But Joe, keeping his composure, gently intervened. "Mrs. Grey, may I ask, where exactly did you find the bracelet? Was anyone else nearby?" His voice remained even and inquisitive. Maggie bristled under the questioning, stumbling over her own story. Details shifted, times and places contradicted. Anita, fighting back tears, held her head high. "I would never take anything from this family," she whispered steadily. Joe's mind raced. He knew what he had to do. That evening, he reviewed the hidden camera footage from the hallway. There it was, Maggie slipping the sapphire bracelet into Anita's cleaning cart before calling out a staged discovery. He saved the clip, heart pounding, not with relief, but with the knowledge that Maggie's mask was starting to crumble. This was the first unambiguous crack in her armor. As security escorted Anita to wait in the study, Joe met Anita's eyes, offering a brief, subtle nod. The nightmare wasn't over, but Anita was no longer alone. The machinery of accusation had been set in motion, but this time justice was quietly on her side. The beginning of Maggie's downfall had arrived. The living room had never felt so heavy with anticipation. Joe stood near the fireplace, still dressed in the chauffeur's uniform, cap pulled low, remote control hidden in his palm. He'd summoned everyone, Maggie, Anita, Claire, and the mansion's head of security. The massive television screen loomed dark and silent against the far wall. Maggie entered with practiced elegance, her expression a mix of irritation and curiosity. Really, Joe, what's this about? If this is about the theft, I've already— Please sit, Joe said quietly, his voice still that of Mr. Lewis. He gestured to the seating arrangement. Maggie hesitated, then settled onto the velvet sofa, eyes narrowing. Claire sat beside Anita on the opposite side, her small hand clutching the maid's arm. Joe approached them gently, kneeling to Claire's eye level. Claire, I need you to be brave. Can you tell everyone here what's been happening? Claire's voice trembled. Aunt Maggie, she's mean to me when Dad isn't home. She calls me names. She kicks my crutch. She locks me in my room. Tears streamed down her face. She says no one will believe me. Maggie shot to her feet. This is absurd. The child is delusional. Joe raised the remote and pressed play. The television screen flickered to life. Maggie's voice filled the room, venomous and clear. You're dead weight, Claire. A crippled child who can't even be grateful. Maggie's face went pale. Another clip played, Maggie kicking Claire's crutch away, the girl collapsing in pain. Anita rushing to shield her. Then the phone call. Once I get guardianship, Claire's inheritance becomes mine. All of it. Maggie's laughter echoed through the speakers, cold and calculating. The room fell silent except for the recordings. Clip after clip, each one more damning than the last. Maggie stood frozen, her hands trembling, her face drained of color. Joe slowly removed his cap, revealing himself fully. I've heard every word you've said to my daughter, Maggie. I've seen every cruel act. I know exactly what you are. Maggie's shock exploded into panic and fury. You spied on me? You deceived me, Joe cut her off, voice hard as steel. You exploited my grief, manipulated my trust, and tormented my child. He turned to security. Escort Mrs. Grey from the property immediately. Her belongings will be sent to her. Maggie lunged forward, desperation twisting her features. Joe, please, you don't understand. I understand perfectly. Joe stepped between her and Claire, his stance unyielding. Security moved in, flanking Maggie. She screamed protests, threats, accusations, but her voice grew fainter as they led her toward the door. The mansion fell silent once more. Joe turned to Claire, kneeling again, tears finally breaking free. I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I should have believed you. Claire collapsed into his arms, sobbing. And for the first time in years, Joe held his daughter, knowing that darkness had finally been expelled. Sunlight poured through the trees, dappling the garden with golden warmth. The mansion felt different now, lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from its foundation. Joe sat on a stone bench beside Claire, watching her trace patterns in the gravel path with the tip of her crutch. Anita stood nearby, watering the flower beds, her presence calm and steady. Joe took a deep breath. Claire, I need to say something. His daughter looked up, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. I'm so sorry I didn't believe you. I should have listened. I should have protected you from the start. Claire's lip trembled. I thought you didn't love me anymore. Joe pulled her close, voice breaking. I love you more than anything in this world. I failed you, and I'll spend every day making that right. He wiped her tears gently. We're going to talk to someone together. A therapist who helps families heal. We'll work through this, I promise. Over the following weeks, they attended therapy sessions together. Joe learned to listen without judgment, to ask questions that allowed Claire to express her fears and pain. Claire, in turn, began to trust again, not just her father, but herself. The sessions became a bridge, rebuilding what Maggie had tried to destroy. One afternoon, Joe called Anita into his study. Anita, I owe you more than words can express. You saw what I couldn't. You protected Claire when I was blind. He paused, emotion tightening his throat. I'd like to offer you a new position. Claire's personal caregiver, protector, and companion. Not as staff, but as family. Anita's eyes filled with tears. Mr. Craig, I don't know what to say. Say yes, Joe replied softly. Claire needs you, and so do I. Anita nodded, smiling through her tears. Yes, of course, yes. In the garden weeks later, Joe watched Claire laugh, a sound he hadn't heard in years. She walked with her crutch confidently now, no longer hunched in fear. Anita played a game with her, and Claire's giggles echoed through the estate, bright and unrestrained. Joe realized then that Anita hadn't just saved Claire. She'd saved him from losing his daughter forever. She'd held the line when he couldn't see the battle, and her courage had given them both a second chance. As the sun set over the garden, Joe stood beside Anita, watching Claire twirl among the flowers. "Thank you," he whispered. Anita smiled. "She's a fighter. She always was." And for the first time since tragedy struck, the Craig mansion felt like a home again, filled not with silence and shadows, but with laughter, hope, and the promise of healing. If this story moved you, share the moment. Don't let it fade. Follow Motherland Stories and tap that like button to keep these voices alive. Every day we uncover strong stories, raw truths, and quiet acts of courage that shape our world. Join a circle of listeners, dreamers, and changemakers, because every story deserves to be heard. This wasn't just an episode, it was a call to remember. Silence hides injustice. Courage exposes it. At Motherland Stories, we don't turn away. We bear witness. Subscribe and stand with stories that challenge power and celebrate truth.